The gun was already drawn when Andrew Whitfield rode back into Salvation Creek. He had told himself he was not coming back. He had ridden 3 miles east with the dry wind at his back and the taste of that woman's well water still on his lips, and he had told himself to keep riding. Keep riding the way he always kept riding, the way he had kept riding from Abilene and from Dodge City, and from every sun-baked town that had ever tried to hold him. But the sound of breaking glass and a woman's sharp, furious cry had carried across the flat Kansas plain like a blade thrown through still air, and his horse had turned before his mind gave the order. Now he was back at the edge of Salvation Creek's single dusty street, and there was a man named Calhoun Hayes standing in front of Eudora Keating's general store with a pistol leveled at her chest. Andrew did not think. He swung down from the saddle in one smooth motion, his boots hitting the packed earth, and he put himself between that gun barrel and the woman before Calhoun Hayes had finished his sentence. "You will give me the deed," Hayes was saying, his voice thick with the kind of authority that comes not from earning it, but from terrifying everyone around you into pretending it is real. "Or I will burn this store down around your ears, Eudora, and the whole town will watch and nobody will lift a finger." "The deed belongs to my father," Eudora said from behind Andrew's left shoulder. Her voice did not shake. That was the thing that struck him hardest, even then, even in the middle of what could easily become his last moment on earth. Her voice was absolutely steady. "And my father is not here to sign anything." "Your father is dead," Hayes said, and the pleasure in his voice was obscene. "He died this morning, and since he died without a legal heir of record in this county, the property reverts to whoever files the claim first. I intend to file within the hour." Andrew felt the air shift behind him and understood that Eudora had just received news of her father's death from the mouth of a man who might very well have caused it, and still she did not crumble. He could feel that from where he stood. He could feel the iron in her spine even across the 3 feet of hot morning air between them. "You want to lower that gun," Andrew said to Hayes, and his own voice was quiet and flat and completely without drama. Hayes looked at him. Hayes was a heavy man in his 50s, with a sheriff's badge pinned crookedly to a vest that cost more than most men in this county made in a season. His eyes moved over Andrew the way a man's eyes move over something he does not yet understand the nature of. "I don't know you," Hayes said. "No," Andrew agreed. "You don't." He stood there in the flat white morning light with a dark past sitting behind his eyes and a hidden purpose that he had not yet fully understood himself, and he waited. That was the moment. That was the highest and most dangerous point of everything that had begun, improbably, impossibly, with a man stopping at a well for water on a slow Tuesday morning in July of 1878. 3 hours earlier, Andrew Whitfield had not known Salvation Creek existed. He had been following the Arkansas River generally eastward through Kansas, without any particular destination in mind, which had been his mode of travel for going on 4 years. He was 28 years old, lean and sun-darkened, with the kind of face that had once been considered handsome in a drawing room back east, and had since been rearranged into something more complicated by weather and time and choices he rarely let himself think about directly. He carried a Winchester rifle in the saddle scabbard and a Colt single-action Army revolver on his hip, not because he was looking for trouble, but because a man who traveled alone through the Western territories without being adequately armed was simply a man who had decided to die on someone else's schedule. His horse was a Grulla mare named Nothing in Particular, which he called the mare, which suited them both. The morning was already brutal, the kind of July heat that came down from a white sky and pressed against the earth, as if the sky and earth were conspiring together to squeeze everything living between them. The mare was thirsty and he was thirsty, and when he saw the cluster of cottonwood trees and the pitched roof of a building rising above them from what looked like a low creek bed cutting through the prairie, he turned toward it without deliberation. Salvation Creek was not much of a town. It had a general store that also served as a post office, a livery stable, A saloon with a piano that had 2 dead keys, a barber shop, a small white church, and perhaps 40 souls scattered across the surrounding farmland and the handful of houses that lined its one named street, which was called Main Street with the kind of optimism that the frontier specialized in. The town's one well stood in the open space between the general store and the church, stone-ringed, hand-cranked, impeccably maintained. Andrew pulled up at the well and dismounted. He drew up a bucket, let the mare drink first, then cupped water into his own hands and drank. The water was cold and clean and tasted of limestone, and he closed his eyes for a moment in something that was not quite gratitude but was adjacent to it. "You are using my well." He opened his eyes. A woman stood on the porch of the general store with her arms crossed and an expression that could have meant several things, not all of them welcoming. She was perhaps 25, dark-haired, with brown eyes that were direct in a way that women's eyes were rarely permitted to be direct in the world he moved through. She wore a practical blue work dress with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and her dark hair was pinned up in a way that suggested she had done it quickly and without a mirror. There was a smear of ink on her left thumb, and the set of her jaw suggested she had opinions about things and expressed them. "I am," Andrew said. "I apologize." "I assumed it was a town well." "It is a town well," she said. "I maintain it. Someone has to, and since my father's health has been declining, I have taken that task on myself." "You are welcome to use it. I was teasing you." He blinked. "Teasing? You looked very solemn about it," she said. "People rarely look solemn about drinking water. Usually they just drink." He found himself looking at her longer than was strictly necessary, which was unusual for him. He was not a man who lingered anywhere, including conversations. "Andrew Whitfield," he said, passing through. "They all are," she said. "Eudora Keating. I run the general store. If you need supplies, come inside. We have flour, cornmeal, salt pork, coffee, and a reasonable selection of ammunition. Also calico and gingham if you have a wife somewhere who needs fabric." "I don't have a wife," he said. "No," she said. "You look like you don't." He was not sure whether that was an observation or an assessment. He tied the mare's reins to the hitching post and walked up to the store porch, and she stepped back to let him inside, and the cool interior with its smells of sawdust and tobacco and dried herbs hit him with a wave of something very close to comfort, which was a feeling he did not trust. The store was small and immaculately ordered, which told him more about Eudora Keating than an hour of conversation might have. Every barrel was labeled. Every shelf was arranged with the taller items at the back and the smaller items at the front. The account book open on the counter was filled with handwriting so precise it might have been typeset. He moved through the store selecting what he needed, coffee and dried beans and a block of salt and a box of cartridges, and she watched him from behind the counter with the calm professional attention of someone who had learned to read strangers quickly. "Where are you headed?" she asked while she was tallying his account. "East," he said. "Generally." "That is not a destination." "No," he said. "It's a direction." "Sometimes that's enough." She looked up from the account book. The directness of her gaze was remarkable in a way he could not fully articulate, only register. "What are you running from?" The question should have put his back up. Most people who asked variants of that question were prying, were looking for weakness, were trying to establish some kind of social leverage. But she asked it the way a doctor might ask where it hurts, with a kind of clinical honesty that suggested she was not asking to wound him but because she thought it was a reasonable question and she wanted a reasonable answer. "Who says I'm running?" he said. "You do," she said. "The way you looked at my store when you came in. Like you were surprised it was clean. Like you hadn't expected anything to be clean in a long time." Men who aren't running from something generally maintain a home base that is organized and comfortable. Men who are running let everything go because there is no point in caring for things you won't be keeping. The silence lasted a full 5 seconds. "That is a considerable amount of observation from a store counter," he said finally. "I have had practice," she said without apology. "My father taught me to read people. He said it was the most important skill a merchant could have." "You don't extend credit to someone you can't read." She paused. "I am sorry, I have overstepped. I do that sometimes." "You haven't overstepped," he said, and the strange thing was he meant it. He paid for his goods in coin, which was not always the case with travelers and which she noted in her account book with a small, approving nod. He packed the supplies into his saddlebags with the methodical efficiency of long practice, and then he stood by the mare in the morning heat and looked back at the store porch, and Eudora Keating was not there anymore. She had gone back inside. He put his foot in the stirrup. He took it back out. He stood there for a moment that was probably shorter than it felt, and in that moment something moved through him that he had not felt in 4 years. It was not attraction exactly, though it was partly that. It was recognition. The particular, unsettling recognition of encountering someone whose inner machinery resembles your own in ways you have never seen reflected anywhere before. He put his foot back in the stirrup. He mounted. He rode east. He made it 3 miles before the scream carried across the flat plain and stopped him cold. Now Hayes was lowering the gun, but not because he had chosen to. He was lowering it because Andrew had, in the 3 seconds of silence, stepped close enough to Hayes that shooting him would have meant gunpowder burns, and something in Hayes's eyes had registered that Andrew Whitfield was not a man who was bluffing. "This is not your business," Hayes said. "I am making it my business," Andrew said. "Put the gun away." Hayes looked past him at Eudora. "This is not finished," he said. "No," she said, "it is not. But you will not finish it by pointing weapons at unarmed women on a public street. Leave." Hayes holstered the gun. He walked away with the deliberate, measured pace of a man who wants everyone watching to understand that he is choosing to leave, that he is not being driven off. He disappeared into the sheriff's office at the end of the street, and Andrew turned around. Eudora Keating's face had gone very white. Not from fear, he understood immediately. From grief. The news about her father had landed, finally, in the seconds while Hayes was leaving, and it had hit her the way a wave hits when you have turned your back to the ocean. "Come inside," he said. She turned without a word and walked into the store, and he followed, closing the door behind him against the growing morning heat, and the eyes he could already feel from windows up and down the street. The eyes of a town that had watched Calhoun Hayes terrorize Eudora Keating, and had kept their shutters closed, and he felt the familiar dark anger that had been his companion for 4 years stir in his chest. Inside, Eudora went to the counter and placed her hands flat on the surface and stood there for a moment breathing. He did not speak. He had learned that grief requires space before it requires words, and he had not always known that, but he had learned it the hard way. "My father has been ill for 6 months," she said finally to the countertop. "I knew he was dying. I thought I had more time, or perhaps I simply did not permit myself to believe the time was actually running out." She straightened. "How did you know to come back?" "I heard you," he said. "Sound carries flat out here. You came back to defend a woman you met for 20 minutes. "I came back because a man had a gun on you," he said. That seemed like a sufficient reason. She looked at him steadily. "Most men in this town have known me for years and did not find it sufficient." He did not have an answer to that would not sound like an indictment of everyone else in Salvation Creek, so he said nothing. "Hayes has been circling my father's property for 2 years, Eudora said, and he understood she needed to talk through it, to lay out the architecture of her situation, because thinking aloud was how she processed. "My father, Thomas Keating, came to this county in 1868 with a homestead claim. He built this store. He built our house behind it. He maintained a water claim on the creek that feeds the well. That water claim is worth considerably more than the property, because this is a dry county, and whoever controls the water source controls everything planted within 10 miles in every direction. And your father has no recorded legal heir," Andrew said. "He has me," she said. "But Kansas law in this county is interpreted very liberally by Calhoun Hayes, who has been the acting sheriff for 7 years, and who also owns the largest cattle operation in the surrounding area, and who has been buying up water rights from smaller landowners for the past 3 years. My father refused to sell. That is why Hayes is doing this now. He is saying that a daughter cannot inherit a water rights claim without a male cosigner on the deed. She paused, which is not actually what Kansas law says. But when the sheriff is also the judge's primary creditor, the law says what Calhoun Hayes needs it to say. Andrew pulled out the chair that stood against the wall and sat down. "Tell me about the deed," he said. She looked at him with that direct, unsettling gaze. "Why?" "Because you are going to fight this," he said. "That is obvious. And you will need to know what you have to work with. You are a drifter passing through," she said. "This morning you were passing through." "I was," he said. "Things changed." Something moved across her face. Not softness exactly, but the precursor to it, the careful opening of a door that had been kept shut for a long time. "The deed is in my father's name with a secondary notation listing Eudora Keating as co-holder. My father added it 18 months ago when he understood that his illness was not going to resolve. He wrote to a lawyer in Wichita who confirmed that the notation was legally sufficient under state law. We have the letter. We have the deed. What we do not have is the ability to get the county recorder to file the transfer because the county recorder reports to Calhoun Hayes." "Where is the deed now?" Andrew asked. "In this store," she said. "In a place Hayes has not found it, despite the fact that his men went through this store twice last spring under the pretense of a tax collection audit." "You need to get to Wichita," Andrew said. "I know that," she said. "I need to get to Wichita with the deed and the letter, and I need to file the transfer directly with the state recorder's office, bypassing the county entirely. But Wichita is 60 miles from here, and Hayes will know within the hour that my father is dead because Hayes probably knows already. And he will have men on every road out of this valley by nightfall." The silence that followed was the kind that happens when two people are doing very rapid calculations simultaneously. "My father's funeral," she said quietly, and her voice shifted into something lower and more private. "I cannot leave without attending to his funeral. He deserves better than to be left for Hayes to manage." "Of course," Andrew said. She looked at him. "You do not have to be here," she said. "I want to be clear about that. You stopped for water. You owe me nothing." "I know that," he said. "Then why are you staying?" And there it was. The question he did not have a clean answer to. Because the clean answer was too much too fast, and the complicated answer required things he had not told anyone in 4 years, and the honest answer sat somewhere between the two. He looked at this woman, Eudora Keating, who had lost her father this morning, and was facing a man who wanted to steal everything her family had built, and who was standing in her own store with her ink-stained thumb and her precise account book and her absolutely unbroken spine. And he thought that he had been running for 4 years, and he was very, very tired. "Because someone should," he said. Her eyes held his for a long moment. Then she nodded once, as if she had decided something. "I will need to close the store," she said. "I need to go to my father." Thomas Keating had died at 7 in the morning in the small house behind the general store, attended by a neighbor woman named Mrs. Collier who had come to help nurse him through his final weeks. The doctor from the next town, a man named Aldrich, had been summoned and had arrived and had signed the death certificate and left, and Mrs. Collier had laid Thomas out in his bedroom with his hands folded and his best suit on and the curtains drawn. Andrew stood in the doorway of that bedroom while Eudora went to her father's side, and he turned away to give her privacy, and he stood in the narrow hallway of the small house and looked at the things on the walls, the framed needlework, the daguerreotype of a younger Thomas Keating with a woman who must have been Eudora's mother, the almanac pages pinned up for reference. And he thought about fathers and about absence, and about the way a life lived honestly leaves evidence of itself in the objects it surrounds itself with. He had not seen his own father in 6 years. That was one of the facts of his dark past that he carried like a stone in his pocket, always there, always weighing the same. When Eudora came back into the hallway, her eyes were wet at the edges, but her face was composed. "I need an hour," she said, "to make arrangements with the pastor for the funeral. Will you wait?" "I'll wait," he said. He waited on the store porch, watching the street, watching the sheriff's office specifically, watching for any movement that suggested Hayes was organizing. The town moved around him with the careful, avoidant energy of a community that knows something dangerous is happening and has collectively decided to pretend otherwise. A woman with a basket crossed the street at the far end rather than pass in front of the store. Two men in front of the saloon looked at him and then looked away. 40 minutes later, a young man of perhaps 17 came running from the direction of the saloon and stopped in front of the porch. "Mister," he said breathlessly, "Hayes has sent a rider to Judge Crowder's place, and he has sent another rider east on the Wichita Road." Andrew stood up. "Who are you?" "Caleb Drummond," the boy said. "My father owned the harness shop. Hayes took it 6 months ago for back taxes that weren't owed. My father moved us to a farm out west of here." He swallowed. "Miss Eudora was kind to us. She extended credit for a year when nobody else would. I don't want Hayes to take her property too." "How did you know to come to me?" Andrew asked. "Because you're the only one who stood up to him today," Caleb said simply. Andrew looked at him. 17, scrawny, brave in the way that only the very young or the very desperate manage to be. "Go back inside somewhere and stay there," he said. "You have done enough, thank you." He went inside to find Eudora. She was in the back room behind the store, which served as a combination office and storage space, standing at a small iron safe that was built into the baseboard. She had the deed in her hand and the lawyer's letter from Wichita folded alongside it. "Hayes has sent riders," Andrew said, "one to Judge Crowder and one east on the Wichita Road." She did not pause. She looked at the papers in her hand and then at him, and then she said, "We cannot take the Wichita Road." "No," he said. "There is a route north," she said. "It follows the creek bed for 12 miles and then cuts northeast through Comanche Crossing. It is longer, it is rougher. But Hayes's men do not know it the way I do, because my father took me along that route every time he went to Wichita by the back way when the roads were washed out in spring." "You know the route," he said. "I know it well," she said. "I have been thinking about this for 6 months, Mr. Whitfield. I knew this day was coming. I did not know what resources I would have when it arrived." She paused. "I need to ask something of you that I have no right to ask." "Ask," he said. "My father's funeral is the day after tomorrow," she said. "Pastor Webb has agreed. But I cannot be here for it if Hayes files with Judge Crowder and gets an injunction against me personally, because an injunction means Hayes's men can physically restrain me. I need to reach Wichita and file that deed before Hayes can get an injunction, and that means I need to leave today. Tonight, before anyone expects it." She met his eyes. "And I need someone who knows what they are doing with a firearm and who has a fast horse, because I have neither." "Your father's funeral," Andrew said quietly. "You are going to miss your father's funeral." "Yes," she said. Her voice was very flat on that word, the way a surface is flat when you have pressed something down beneath it with the entire weight of your body. "Yes, I am going to miss my father's funeral. And I am going to carry that for the rest of my life, and there is nothing I can do about it, except make sure that what he built does not disappear the day after they put him in the ground." Andrew looked at this woman, this absolutely remarkable woman, and felt something happen in his chest that he had no preparation for and no framework to understand. It was not the quick hot feeling of attraction, though that was present too. It was something deeper and slower and more frightening, the recognition of someone whose courage is so genuine and so costly that it takes your breath away. "We go tonight," he said. "At what time does Hayes normally post men?" "Not before 10, she said. "His crew drinks until 9 at the saloon. It is the one reliable thing about them. Then we go at 8, he said. "I need to stable my horse somewhere safe until then, not the livery." "The Drummond boy," she said immediately. "His farm is west of town. He can be trusted, and Hayes would not think to look there." So began the long, careful, dangerous day of preparation. Andrew spent the morning hours appearing to be what he had originally been, a drifter with no particular ties to anything, eating a meal at the saloon, asking idle questions about the territory that could not be construed as intelligence gathering. He was good at this. He had been doing it for 4 years, moving through places without leaving marks, gathering information without appearing to gather it. It was a skill from his past life, the life before Kansas and before the decisions that had put him on the road, and he used it now without letting himself think too carefully about the fact that he was using it for someone else's benefit. That was a new thing, using the skills his dark past had given him for a purpose that felt clean. What he learned was this. Calhoun Hayes had 3 men he relied on for enforcement, a man called Dutch who was a former Army scout, and 2 brothers named Greer who had come out from Missouri with histories that included several cattle-related incidents. Dutch was the dangerous one. The Greer brothers were brutal but not clever. Hayes himself was clever but not physically dangerous. He used fear and legal manipulation the way other men used fists. He learned also that the county recorder was a man named Pettiford who genuinely did not like Hayes but was afraid enough to comply with whatever Hayes needed. Pettiford, Andrew noted, had a daughter who lived in Wichita. A detail, possibly irrelevant, possibly not. In the afternoon, Andrew found Pastor Webb, a small spare man of about 50, with the permanently surprised expression of someone who had entered the ministry, hoping for spiritual clarity, and found instead that most of his time was spent mediating property disputes and livestock theft. Andrew spoke to him honestly. "Miss Keating cannot be at the funeral," he said. "She is going to Wichita tonight to file the property deed before Hayes can block it." The pastor looked pained. "This is a very complicated situation." "It is," Andrew agreed. "Will you hold the funeral with dignity regardless?" "Of course," the pastor said, offended. "Thomas Keating was a good man. He will receive what he deserves from this church regardless of the circumstances." He paused. "Tell Eudora that her father will be sent off properly. Tell her I will read the psalm he liked. He was fond of the 23rd. "I will tell her," Andrew said, and meant it. He went to the Drummond farm and arranged for the mare to be kept there until evening. Caleb Drummond's father, a weathered, quiet man named Robert, listened to the arrangement and nodded and said only, "You will look after Eudora." "Yes," Andrew said. Robert Drummond looked at him the way a man looks at someone he is trying to decide whether to trust with something precious. Then he nodded again. "Good enough." At sunset, Eudora closed the store. She moved through the small house behind the store with the controlled, deliberate efficiency of someone who is refusing to be overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they are doing, packing what she needed into a single saddlebag and a canvas carryall. She wrapped the deed and the lawyer's letter in oilskin and tucked them against her body inside her jacket. She left a letter for Mrs. Collier regarding her father's belongings and the arrangements she had made with Pastor Webb. She came out of the back of the house into the kitchen and found Andrew there, and for a moment she simply looked at him standing at her kitchen table in the early evening light, and something passed across her face that was complicated and layered and might, in different circumstances, have been called longing. "Are you afraid?" he asked. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "I'm also determined. Both things are true simultaneously." "That is usually how courage works," he said. She looked at him. "Who are you, Andrew Whitfield? Really?" The question sat in the air between them, and he owed her an answer, given what she was asking him to risk alongside her. "I was a Pinkerton agent," he said. "For 5 years, based out of Chicago." Her eyes changed. "Was," she said. 4 years ago I was assigned to investigate a labor action in a Pennsylvania coal mine," he said. "There were workers who were organizing. My job was to infiltrate the organization and provide information that would allow the mine owners to break it up. I did my job. I provided the information." He paused. 3 men were killed when the Pinkerton guards moved in. They were not organizers. They were ordinary miners who happened to be nearby. One of them was 19 years old. The kitchen was very quiet. "I resigned the same day," he said. "I have been moving west ever since, because I needed to be somewhere I could not be found by the people who would prefer I not discuss what I witnessed, and because I needed to be somewhere that did not require me to be anyone in particular while I figured out what kind of person I was actually going to be." Eudora was quiet for a long moment, And have you figured that out? I am working on it, he said. That is an honest answer, she said. You seem to prefer those, he said. I do, she said. Very much. She picked up her saddlebag. We should go. They slipped out the back of the property in the deep blue of early evening, moving along the creek bank where the cottonwood shadows were thick, and Andrew led the mare from where Caleb had brought her along the edge of a wheat field, while Eudora moved ahead on her father's bay gelding, an aging but sturdy animal named Prospero. They did not speak. The town behind them flickered with lamplight and the distant sound of the saloon piano, and Andrew kept his eyes on the darkness ahead and his ears tuned to the darkness behind, and they cleared the edge of the cultivated land and moved into the open prairie at 8:30. The stars came out all at once the way they do on the Kansas plain, not gradually but in a sudden brilliant expanse, as if someone had thrown a cloth of diamonds across the sky. Eudora rode ahead of him on the creekside trail she knew by memory, and he followed, watching the landscape for any movement that should not be there. And gradually the town lights disappeared behind them, and there was only the creek and the grass and the enormous dark sky. They rode for 2 hours in near silence before she pulled up and said, "We can rest here. There is a place where the bank widens. Prospero needs water and so does your mare." They dismounted and let the horses drink, and Andrew filled his canteen from the creek and handed it to her without speaking. She drank and handed it back and sat down on a flat rock at the water's edge, and for the first time since the morning her posture was not completely controlled. Her shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. She rubbed her eyes with the heels of her hands. "Pastor Webb," Andrew said. "He said to tell you he will read the 23rd Psalm. He said your father was fond of it." She went very still. "He said Thomas Keating was a good man," Andrew continued, "and that he will be sent off properly." Eudora put her hand over her mouth. She kept it there for 15 seconds, breathing through her nose, and then she lowered it. Her eyes were wet, but she did not let the tears fall. It seemed to cost her something not to let them fall. He watched the cost. "He was a good man," she said. "He came west from Ohio in 1867 with my mother and $3 and a wagon and built everything from nothing. My mother died of typhoid in 1872. He raised me alone after that, and he never once made me feel that having a daughter instead of a son was a disadvantage. He taught me the accounts. He taught me to maintain the well. He taught me to read people." She paused. "He taught me that property is just work made solid. That the store is not wood and nails, it is 30 years of early mornings and careful decisions and extending credit to people who needed it. And I will not let Calhoun Hayes take 30 years of my father's work." "You won't," Andrew said. She looked at him across the creek bank in the starlight. "Why do you say it like that?" "Like what?" "Like it is a certainty," she said. "You say it the way people say things they know to be true." "Because I have been in places where people with nothing but righteous cause and correct paperwork won against people with money and guns," he said. "Not always, but it happens. And you have both cause and paperwork." "And you," she said softly. "And me," he agreed. The moment between them was tender in the way that moments are when two people are exhausted and scared and telling the truth in the dark. It was not the moment for anything more than what it was, and both of them seemed to understand that. But something was building between them that had been building since she had teased him about looking solemn at the well, something quiet and inevitable and deeply alarming to him personally. They rode through the night in stages, resting the horses, watching behind them. Twice Andrew thought he heard hoofbeats that were not their own, and both times they went still in a creek hollow and waited, and both times the sound resolved into something else, wind in the grass or a spooked deer moving through the brush. The Kansas night was full of sounds that were almost but not quite the sounds of being followed. At 3 in the morning they stopped in a dry hollow and slept for 3 hours in shifts, Andrew taking the first watch and then shaking Eudora awake and lying down in the grass wrapped in his saddle blanket, while she sat against a cottonwood with her rifle across her knees. He did not expect to sleep, and he did sleep anyway. which told him something about how tired he had been, and also, if he was being honest, something about the particular quality of feeling safe that came from knowing Eudora Keating was keeping watch. He woke at first light to find her standing at the edge of the hollow looking east at the pink rim of the horizon, and the expression on her face was so unguarded and so full of complicated feeling, grief and determination, and something frightened, and something very much alive, that he stopped himself from speaking for a moment just to let her have it. Then she turned and saw him watching, and neither of them was embarrassed exactly, but both of them looked away at the same moment and then back, and she said, "Good morning, Mr. Whitfield," in her precise, direct way, and he said, "Good morning, Miss Keating," and they saddled the horses. The second day of riding brought them through Comanche Crossing, which was not a town but a geographical feature, a low stone ford across the Arkansas River that Eudora's father had used for 30 years, and which still appeared on no map that Hayes's men were likely to carry. They crossed in the early morning before the heat became serious, and on the far bank Eudora stopped and turned in her saddle and looked back across the river. "That is the furthest I have been from home in 8 years," she said. "Does it feel like something?" he asked. She thought about it. "It feels like falling," she said. "But the kind of falling where you are not certain there is ground beneath you. It could be flying. I cannot tell yet." He looked at her profile against the bright morning sky, the dark hair coming loose from its pins after a night of riding, the ink stain still visible on her left thumb because she had not had occasion to scrub it away, and he felt that recognition again, that resonance, that terrifying sense of finding something he had not known he was looking for. "Tell me something," he said, because he wanted to hear her talk, which was something he had not wanted with anyone in a very long time. "What kind of something?" she asked. "Something that matters to you," he said. "Something you have not said to anyone recently." She looked at him sidelong, assessing, and then she said, "I have been writing a letter to the Kansas State Legislature for 6 months about the way county sheriffs in this territory are permitted to act as de facto judges in property matters. It is currently 14 pages long. It has citations to 3 separate state statutes and 1 federal precedent. I have not sent it because I was afraid that sending it would accelerate Hayes's timeline for moving against my father's property." She paused. "I intend to send it once the deed is transferred. Even if it does nothing, I intend to say it." He felt something warm and entirely involuntary move through his chest. "You wrote a 14-page letter to the legislature," he said. "I have revised it 11 times," she said. "The current draft is quite good." He laughed. It surprised him. He could not remember the last time he had laughed, actually laughed, not the social variety but the real thing, and she turned to look at him when he did it, and she smiled, a quick bright smile that transformed her face entirely, and they were both suddenly embarrassed again in the way that people are embarrassed when they have shown each other something genuine. "It sounds like an excellent letter," he said. "It is," she said, without false modesty. "I know the statutes better than most lawyers in this state." They rode on through the growing heat of the Kansas morning, and this time they talked. He told her about Chicago. She told him about Ohio, which she could barely remember having come west at age 4. He told her about the coal mine, more than he had told her the night before, the particular way the lamplight looked underground, the particular way sound traveled through rock, the particular sound of the shots that killed 3 men while he stood in the shadow of a mine cart and watched and did nothing. She listened without flinching. She told him about the year her mother died, the year she was 11 and learned to run the store accounts and maintain the well and read people the way her father had taught her, and the way grief at 11 is so large and so without framework that you build frameworks around it like you build walls around a fire, not to put it out but to contain it enough to live beside it. "We are both people who have built frameworks around fires," he said. "Yes," she said. "I recognized that in you at the store. That is part of why I asked what you were running from. Does it ever burn through," he asked, "the framework?" "Sometimes," she said, "in the night. Or unexpectedly in the middle of an ordinary morning like today." She looked at her hands on the reins, But you get to practice. You get better at rebuilding it faster. I think you get better at more than that, he said quietly. I think you get better at knowing what is worth building around and what you should just let burn and be done with. She was quiet for a long time after that. Then she said, "What would you let burn now?" "The last 4 years," he said. "The running. The pretending nowhere is home." "And what would you build around?" he said. He was looking at her when he said it, and she was looking ahead at the trail, and she knew what he meant. He could tell she knew because her hands tightened very slightly on the reins and then released, and her chin came up a fraction of an inch. She did not answer, but she did not ask him to retract it either. They reached the outskirts of Wichita in the late afternoon of the second day. The city was a revelation after 60 miles of prairie, brick buildings, and telegraph lines, and the smell of the railroad yards, and the noise of 1,000 people conducting their lives in concentrated proximity. Eudora had been to Wichita twice before, both times with her father, and she navigated it with the careful attention of someone in unfamiliar country. The state recorder's office was in a building on Douglas Avenue, and they arrived 40 minutes before closing. Andrew kept watch outside while Eudora went in with the deed, and the lawyer's letter and her father's death certificate, and the secondary notation that listed her as co-holder. And she stood at the counter and filed the transfer of the water rights claim and the general property deed into her sole name as inheriting co-holder under Kansas inheritance law as clarified by the state office. And the clerk, a methodical young man who appeared to have no awareness of or interest in the local politics of Salvation Creek County, stamped the papers and recorded the transfer and handed Eudora a certified copy and wished her a good evening. She came out of the building and down the steps, and Andrew was waiting at the bottom of them, and she held up the certified copy of the transfer, and for a moment she simply stood there with it in her hand, and her eyes were very bright. "It is done," he said. "It is done," she said. "Filed and certified and recorded in the state office. Hayes cannot touch it. He would have to challenge the transfer in state court, and the letter from the Wichita lawyer establishing the legality of the secondary notation is in the state record now. His county judge has no jurisdiction over a state-recorded transfer." She took a breath. "It is done." He put his hand out and she took it, and they stood on the steps of the state recorder's office in Wichita, Kansas, in the year 1878, and held hands for a moment that was so full of relief and exhaustion, and something neither of them had named, yet that neither of them moved. Then she let go of his hand and straightened her jacket and said, "We need to find rooms for the night, and I need to send a telegram." The telegram went to Pastor Webb in Salvation Creek, informing him that the deed was transferred, and asking him to inform the county recorder Pettiford of the state recording number. She also sent a telegram to the lawyer in Wichita, a man named Forsyth, whose letter had been so instrumental in the transfer, informing him of the completion and asking him to remain available should Hayes attempt a legal challenge. Andrew secured 2 rooms at a respectable hotel on Main Street, paying for them separately and registering them separately, which was the correct and appropriate thing to do, and also cost him a small private effort, because the thought of being separated from her by 2 walls and a hallway after 2 days of riding together through the night felt like an unnecessary distance. They ate dinner together in the hotel dining room, an event that was so civilized and so ordinary after everything that had preceded it that both of them were slightly undone by it. White tablecloths, candles, a waiter who brought soup and then beef and then pie and treated them with professional courtesy. Eudora sat across from him and ate with the careful, practiced manners of a woman who had grown up in a store but had also been taught by a father who believed in dignity. And Andrew sat across from her and realized he was memorizing the way she looked in candlelight, and that this was a thing he was doing consciously and deliberately, because some part of him had already accepted that he was going to carry this woman in his memory for a very long time and wanted to do it accurately. "Where will you go?" she asked after. "I had not thought past Wichita," he said. That is what you said about your direction, she said. East, generally. Yes, she cut a piece of pie. Andrew, she said, and his name in her mouth was something he felt behind his sternum. I want to say something, and I want you to let me say it completely before you respond. All right, he said. I am not a woman who is practiced at this kind of conversation, she said. I have lived in a town of 40 people for most of my adult life, and I have been too busy maintaining my father's store and my father's well, and fighting my father's battles to devote much energy to the particular area of human experience that this conversation is edging toward. So I am going to be direct in the way that I am always direct, and I ask you to forgive any clumsiness in how it comes out. She set down her fork. I do not want you to go east. I want you to come back to Salvation Creek with me, not for any immediate reason other than the fact that being in your company is the least alone I have felt in 8 years, and I think you might feel something similar, and I think we are both old enough and have both suffered enough not to pretend otherwise for the sake of propriety. The dining room was quiet around them. The candle between them threw warm light across her face, the set jaw and the direct eyes and the ink stain that was finally beginning to fade from her thumb. Eudora, he said. You may now respond, she said, with the tiniest hint of the same teasing tone she had used on the store porch when she accused him of looking solemn at the well. I was going to say, he said, that I have not been this sure of anything in 4 years, and that certainty in my current state is a significant and somewhat terrifying thing, and that yes, I will come back with you. She looked at him. The careful, composed face broke open just slightly, just enough to show what was underneath it, which was something luminous and a little overwhelmed and very, very real. Good, she said. I am glad. She picked up her fork again. Now eat your pie. We have a long ride back tomorrow, and I intend to be at the grave before dusk if we can manage it. They rode back to Salvation Creek the next morning by the longer road, the main road, because there was no longer any reason for secrecy, and they rode at a pace that was faster than the outward journey because both horses were rested, and because Eudora wanted to be at her father's grave before dark. They arrived in Salvation Creek in the late afternoon to find it in a state of contained electricity, the way small towns are when they know something has happened or is about to happen, and they are waiting to understand which way it will land. Several people came out of buildings as they rode down Main Street. Caleb Drummond appeared from somewhere and took the horses. Mrs. Collier came out of the house behind the store and embraced Eudora without speaking. Pastor Webb was at the churchyard. He had buried Thomas Keating that morning, as arranged, with appropriate ceremony, and with the 23rd Psalm, and with, he told Eudora, more of the town in attendance than he had expected, which Andrew thought said something about the difference between what people will do publicly when they are afraid, and what they will do when a man they respected dies, and there is no immediate threat to attending his funeral. Eudora stood at the grave in the slanted afternoon light, and Andrew stood a respectful distance behind her. The headstone was already in place, Thomas Keating, 1828 to 1878, and the earth was fresh and dark and smelled of rain, though it had not rained, which was the particular smell of newly turned soil. He watched her from across the churchyard, and he did not go to her, and he did not speak. He let her have the time with her father without witness. After perhaps 20 minutes she turned and walked back to where he stood at the churchyard gate, and her face was washed clean of the controlled composure in a way that was not weakness but release, and she stood in front of him and said, "He would have liked you." "Would he?" Andrew said. "He would have been very suspicious of you at first," she said. "He was suspicious of everyone at first, but then he would have seen through it and he would have liked what he saw." She paused. "He would have teased me about it relentlessly." Andrew felt the smile before he could stop it. "Teasing," he said. "Apparently it runs in the family." "It does," she said, and smiled back. And then she took his hand again, not the brief hand-holding of the recorder's office steps, but a deliberate, sustained taking of his hand, her fingers through his, and they walked out of the churchyard together. Calhoun Hayes made his move the next morning. He appeared at the general store with Dutch and the two Greer brothers and a paper he claimed was an injunction from Judge Crowder, and Andrew was already on the porch when they arrived. "Miss Keating will want to respond to that paper herself," Andrew said. "She is inside. I will let her know you are here." He went inside, and Eudora was already at the counter with a certified copy of the state recorder's transfer in one hand and the letter from lawyer Forsyth in the other. "He has an injunction from Crowder," Andrew said. "County court," Eudora said. "That injunction covers county-recorded property. My deed is now a state-recorded transfer. County court has no jurisdiction." She was already moving toward the door. She stepped onto the porch with both documents, and she held them out to Hayes, and she explained to him, in language that was so clear and so precisely legal that even Dutch appeared to follow it, exactly why his injunction was worth less than the paper it was printed on. Hayes read the state recording number on the certified copy. Andrew watched his face go through several stages of calculation and land on something that was not quite defeat but was the recognition of defeat. "This is not finished," Hayes said. The same words he had said on the first morning, but they sounded different now. They sounded like the opening of a performance that had already lost its audience. "You are welcome to challenge the transfer in state court," Eudora said. "Mr. Forsyth in Wichita will be happy to represent my interests. He finds these cases educational." She paused. "And my 14-page letter to the state legislature has also now been sent, which means that the specific legal practices of this county are about to receive a degree of attention that I expect you will find uncomfortable." Hayes looked at Andrew. Andrew looked back at him with the flat, patient gaze he had developed over years of watching dangerous men decide whether the cost of a confrontation was worth what they stood to gain, and Hayes made the correct calculation. He left. Dutch followed him, and the Greer brothers followed Dutch, and the street outside the store was empty and ordinary and blazing with July sunlight, and Eudora let out a long, slow breath that she appeared to have been holding since approximately the beginning of the exchange. Andrew put his hand on her shoulder. She turned and looked up at him. "It is not finished," she said, echoing Hayes. "He will try something else." "Probably," Andrew said, "but not today. And every day that passes with the state recording intact makes it harder." She leaned against him. Not dramatically, not heavily, just a slight lean, the kind of lean that says, "I am tired and you are solid and I trust you to hold some of this with me." He put his arm around her shoulders and she let him, and they stood on the porch of her father's store in the summer heat and looked at the street and the town that was slowly, cautiously beginning to show itself again, curtains parting, doors opening, people remembering that they had business outside. "I need to reopen the store," she said. "Yes," he said. "And you need to find somewhere to stay," she said. "The saloon has rooms," he said. "I have been told." "The saloon has rooms," she agreed. "They are not ideal, but they are functional." He took his arm from her shoulders and she stepped inside to open the store, and he went to the saloon and arranged a room, and then he spent the afternoon doing something he had not done in 4 years, which was staying in a place after his business there was concluded. It was strange to him. He kept expecting to feel the familiar pull toward the horse, toward east or west or south, toward the next unnamed destination. But the pull was not there, or rather it was overridden by something stronger, which was the pull toward the general store, and the woman inside it, and the particular gravity she seemed to exert on him, which was not manipulation and was not a trap, and was simply the genuine force of one person on another when the people involved are honest enough to feel it fully. He came back to the store at noon. He helped her move a barrel of cornmeal that had been delivered. In the afternoon, he fixed a broken hinge on the front door that had been sticking, and she brought him coffee without being asked, and they talked while he worked, easy talk about the town and the people in it, and she told him about each family she knew, and he understood that she knew them the way a merchant knows the community they serve, thoroughly, affectionately, without illusion. "The Drummonds," she said. "Robert Drummond is a good man." He had the best harness shop in 4 counties, and Hayes took it for a tax debt that Drummond disputes and cannot afford to legally contest. When I send that letter to the legislature, it includes the Drummond case." "Good," Andrew said. "And the Wickersham family, out on the East Road, Hayes pressured them into selling their water rights 2 years ago for a price that was criminal. 3 other families beside them have similar situations." She paused. "This county is being quietly strangled by one man who has found a way to make the law do what he needs it to do. I have been documenting it for 2 years." He set down the screwdriver and looked at her. "How long have you been doing this alone?" "Since my father became ill," she said. "Before that he helped, but for the past 6 months it has been me, the account books, and the letter." "You should have had help," he said. "I agree," she said. "But help did not present itself until a man stopped at my well for water." He looked at her. She looked at him. Something passed between them that was layered and complex and entirely clear at the same time. "I want to help with the letter," he said, "and with the Drummond case and the Wickersham case. I have experience with the legal architecture of these situations from my time with the agency. I know how to document a pattern of abuse in a way that is useful to a legislative inquiry." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "That would be very valuable." "It might take a while," he said carefully, "months, to do it properly." "I imagine it would," she said. "You would need somewhere to live for that length of time. The saloon rooms are not ideal for long-term occupation." "No," he said, "they are not. There is a small house at the western end of Main Street that has been empty for 3 months," she said. "The Andersons moved to Topeka. The property is available for rent. I know because I have the key, which Mr. Anderson left with me in case anyone inquired." "That is a very practical suggestion," he said. "I am a very practical woman," she said. And then the quick, bright smile again, and he held it in his memory alongside the candlelight image from Wichita, building a catalog of her. He rented the Anderson house. It was small and drafty and needed work, which he set about providing with the methodical industry of a man who had been living out of saddlebags for 4 years and had a considerable backlog of domestic energy. He repaired the roof, which had developed a leak. He replaced 2 boards in the porch floor. He whitewashed the inside walls, which made the single room much brighter and more habitable. Eudora came to see it one evening a week after he had moved in and stood in the doorway and looked at the whitewashed walls and the neat shelves he had built from scrap timber and said, "You have made it quite habitable." "I had good material to work with," he said. "It is a solid structure under the neglect." She looked at the shelves. "You have very few possessions," she said. "I have been traveling light for a while," he said. "What did you have," she said, "before?" He sat down at the small table he had dragged in from the back porch and considered it. "A house in Chicago, a good coat, a considerable library which I left behind when I resigned. Books are heavy." He paused. "A life that looked organized from the outside and was mostly empty on the inside." She came inside and sat across from him at the table. "What filled it?" she said, "before it emptied?" "Work," he said. "The agency work. I was very good at it. I told myself that being very good at something was the same as it mattering. But it was not," she said. "No," he said. "It was not." She was looking at him with that direct, clear gaze, and he was looking back at her, and the evening light was coming through the window he had cleaned, and the air in the small room was warm and smelled of fresh whitewash, and she said, "I told you that being in your company is the least alone I have felt in 8 years. That is still true." "It is the same for me," he said. "More true every day." She looked down at her hands on the table, then she looked up. "I am not afraid of you," she said. "I want you to know that. A lot of women in my position would be afraid of a man like you, a man with your history, a man who appears suddenly and knows how to handle a gun and has spent 4 years with no fixed address. But I have read you very carefully and I am not afraid." "That means a great deal to me," he said. "What does frighten me," she said, slowly and with the precision of someone choosing each word deliberately, "is wanting something and not getting it, wanting something and then having it taken away. I have had enough of things being taken." "I understand," he said. "I do not intend to take anything. I intend to stay." "You said months," she said. "I said it might take months to do the documentation properly," he said. "That was technically accurate. It might also take considerably longer." She met his eyes. "How much longer?" "I think," he said carefully, "that if you are willing, it could take a lifetime." The room was very quiet. Outside the window, the Kansas evening was going purple, and the first bats were moving through the trees along the creek, and the town of Salvation Creek was putting itself to bed with its customary collection of sounds. Eudora Keating reached across the table and put her hand over his, her ink-stained thumb and her capable, direct, extraordinary hand, and she said, "I think that is a reasonable timeline." The months that followed were some of the most substantive of Andrew Whitfield's life. He worked with Eudora on the legislative letter, and the two of them together expanded it from 14 pages to 32, with attached documentation of 9 separate cases of property coercion in the county, each one sourced and dated and cross-referenced with the relevant statute. They mailed the complete document to 3 separate members of the Kansas state legislature, to the state attorney general's office, and to a newspaper in Topeka that had been running a series of articles on frontier legal abuses. Lawyer Forsyth in Wichita turned out to be a man of genuine appetite for exactly this kind of case, and he wrote back immediately upon receiving a copy of the documentation, offering to represent the interests of any affected party who wished to bring a formal complaint to the state court. The Drummond family signed on first. 2 other families signed on within the month. Calhoun Hayes, true to his promise that things were not finished, attempted 3 separate legal maneuvers to challenge Eudora's deed transfer, each of which Forsyth batted aside with what Eudora described as evident pleasure. In October, a state investigator arrived in Salvation Creek to review the documentation they had submitted, and Hayes was notably absent from town for the 3 days the investigator was present. In December, the Topeka newspaper ran 2 articles on the Salvation Creek situation, naming Hayes by name and citing several of the cases from the documentation Andrew and Eudora had compiled. The county recorder Pettiford, who had reportedly been looking for a reason to feel brave, provided a signed statement to the state investigator that included details of the pressure Hayes had applied to the county court and the tax records over the preceding 5 years. Hayes resigned the sheriff's office in January 1879 under circumstances that were legally described as voluntary, but were understood by everyone in the county as the only option left to him short of a full state indictment. He sold his cattle operation and moved out of the county by spring. His buyers, 3 separate men, paid fair market price for 3 separate parcels of land, and the water rights he had accumulated were placed under a county trust administered by the new county recorder, who was not appointed by anyone with a conflict of interest. It was not a perfect resolution. Andrew was honest about that. Men like Hayes rarely disappeared cleanly. The families who had sold at coerced prices did not get their money back. The Drummond harness shop was gone, but the pattern was broken and the documentation was in the state record, and the precedent had been established that this particular county was not beyond the reach of oversight. Robert Drummond shook Andrew's hand on the street one February morning and said, "Eudora told me you wrote most of the legal sections of that document." "Eudora wrote most of it," Andrew said. "I helped with the structure. She also told me that," Robert said. "She said you are too modest about it." He paused. "She talks about you quite a lot." "Does she?" Andrew said. "She does," Robert said, and smiled in the way that older men smile at younger men who are being deliberately obtuse about something obvious. He proposed to Eudora in February 1879, which is to say, he raised the subject in the direct, honest way that they had established between them from the beginning, sitting at her kitchen table with coffee between them on a February evening when the snow was coming down outside and the store was closed, and he said, "I want to marry you. I want to ask whether you want to marry me." She put her coffee cup down. She looked at him for a moment with the full force of that direct gaze. "I have thought about it extensively," she said. "I have considered whether I want to give up the independence that I have worked very hard to maintain. I have considered whether marrying you would complicate the legal situation regarding the property deed, which it will not, since the deed is already in my sole name at the state level. I have considered whether I trust you to respect my autonomy and my judgment and my 14-page letter to the legislature. And," he said, "and I conclude that yes," she said, "I want to marry you, very much." They were married in March 1879, in the small white church in Salvation Creek, by Pastor Webb, who read from the 23rd Psalm at Eudora's request, and who had the permanently surprised expression of someone who had not expected his small town to generate this much narrative resolution in 1 year. Robert and Caleb Drummond were there, and Mrs. Collier, and the Wickersham family and 2 of the other families who had been part of the legislative documentation. The general store was closed for the day. Eudora wore a dress she had ordered from a catalog in Wichita, dark blue silk with white trim, which arrived 3 days before the wedding and which fit perfectly because she had measured herself with the precision she applied to everything. Andrew wore his best coat, which was the coat he had bought before leaving Chicago and which was somewhat out of fashion but still presentable. He had polished his boots. She came down the aisle of the small church on Caleb Drummond's arm, because Caleb was the person she trusted, and because Robert Drummond was saving a seat for her at the front. And Andrew stood at the altar and watched her walk toward him and felt something he did not have a word for, something that was not just love, though it was certainly love, but also the deep and particular relief of a man who has been walking for a very long time and has finally found a place worth stopping. They stood in front of Pastor Webb in the winter-pale light of the church windows, and they made their promises, and Andrew meant every word of his with the completeness of a person who has learned, through very costly experience, what it means to say something and not mean it. When Pastor Webb said he could kiss his bride, Andrew took Eudora's face in both hands with a gentleness that surprised him, and she looked up at him for a moment before he bent to kiss her. And her eyes were full of everything she had said, and everything she had not said, and everything they were going to say to each other in the years ahead. And he kissed her, and she kissed him back, and the small congregation of Salvation Creek made exactly the sounds that small congregations make in such moments. Afterward, on the church steps in the February cold, with a thin Kansas sun throwing pale light across the churchyard and her father's grave visible through the iron fence, Eudora took his arm and leaned against his shoulder and said, "You stopped for water." "I did," he said. "You should have kept riding," she said, with the teasing note that had become his favorite sound. "I know," he said, "but the water was very good." She laughed, and he pulled her closer, and they stood in the cold church step sunlight with the town of Salvation Creek around them and the broad Kansas sky above them. And Andrew Whitfield, who had been running for 4 years and had been empty for longer than that, was completely, entirely, permanently still. They lived in the storehouse, the small house behind the general store where Thomas Keating had lived and died, because it was the right size and because Eudora was attached to it, and because the store needed someone close at hand. Andrew converted the back storage room into a proper office, with shelves along all 4 walls and a wide desk for the account books and the ongoing correspondence with Forsyth in Wichita, and the documentation work he had begun for 2 neighboring counties, where similar patterns of legal abuse were emerging. He had found, improbably, a vocation. He was good at what Eudora called making the law visible, at finding the places where the gap between what the law said and what powerful men did with it was exploitable, and at translating that gap into language that legislators and investigators could use. It was related to the investigative work he had done for the Pinkerton Agency, but pointed in a completely different direction, and it used the same skills in service of something he could feel honest about. He wrote to his father in the spring, a letter that was not easy to write and took 4 drafts and was shorter than he wanted and longer than it needed to be. His father, who lived in Massachusetts and was by now in his 70s, wrote back within 6 weeks with a letter that was also not easy and also shorter than it wanted to be, and which ended with the words, "I am glad you have found your ground." His mother had died the previous year, which he had not known, and that was a grief he had to find a place for. But his father was alive, and the correspondence was reopened, and that was something he had not expected and was grateful for. Eudora read his father's letter over his shoulder and said nothing, which was exactly the right thing to say, and then she made him dinner and they ate together and talked about other things, which was also exactly right. In September of 1879, Eudora told him she was expecting a child. She told him at breakfast directly, with the precise matter-of-fact delivery that was her characteristic mode, though her eyes were doing something more complicated than her voice was. He put down his coffee cup. He looked at her. And then he stood up and came around the table and took her face in his hands again the way he had at the altar, and he said, "Good morning, Miss Keating," which was what he had said on the first morning after their night ride to Wichita, and she laughed and covered his hands with hers. Their son was born in April 1880, a large, healthy boy with Eudora's dark hair and Andrew's gray eyes, who announced his arrival at 4 in the morning with considerable conviction, and who was named Thomas Andrew Whitfield, Thomas for her father and Andrew for his own, which Andrew thought was an entirely correct arrangement. He sat by Eudora's bed in the hours after the birth with the baby in his arms, which was a weight and a warmth unlike anything he had ever held, and Eudora was sleeping the deep, fierce sleep of someone who has done something enormous and is now consolidating. And he looked at his son's face in the lamplight and thought about Thomas Keating, who had come west from Ohio with $3 and a wagon, and about his own father in Massachusetts, and about the choices that carry forward through generations like water through limestone, shaping everything they move through. The store continued. Eudora ran it with the precision and care she had always applied to it, and if people noticed that she was more relaxed than she had been before, that the edge of controlled tension that had been her constant companion during the Hayes years had softened, they said so in the direct, neighborly way of small communities. Mrs. Collier told her she looked well. Robert Drummond told her she looked like someone who had finally been able to put something down. Caleb Drummond, who was now 19 and working on a farm outside town, and had recently been seen walking with a girl from the Wickersham family, told her she looked happy, and she told him that this was a reasonable observation. The legislative work continued as well. The documentation Andrew and Eudora had compiled for Salvation Creek County became, with Forsyth's help, the basis for a proposed amendment to the Kansas statute governing county-level property recording, which would require all contested transfers above a certain value to be filed simultaneously at the state level. It did not pass in the first session. It passed in the third, in 1882, by which time Andrew had been to Topeka twice to speak to the relevant committee, and Eudora's 32-page letter had been cited in the committee record 4 separate times. She had also written, by then, 2 additional letters, one regarding the treatment of water rights in drought years, and one regarding the specific legal disabilities that Kansas law still imposed on married women in property matters, the latter of which was longer than the first letter and considerably more pointed. Both were in committee as of the spring of 1882. In the summer of 1882, Eudora told him she was expecting again, which she did at dinner this time rather than breakfast, and his reaction was essentially the same as before except that Thomas, who was 2 years old and highly opinionated about everything happening around him, was present and demanded to know what was happening. They told him that he was going to have a brother or a sister, and he considered this with the profound seriousness of a 2-year-old, and then returned to his cornbread. Their second child, a daughter they named Clara after Eudora's mother, arrived in February 1883, red-faced and furious and entirely healthy. Thomas, at nearly 3, was introduced to her with appropriate ceremony and studied her with the concentrated skepticism of the firstborn before finally pronouncing her acceptable, which was the highest compliment available to him at the time. Eudora recovered quickly, as she did everything, with the determined efficiency that characterized her approach to all physical challenges. She was back behind the store counter 6 weeks after Clara's birth, which Andrew initially argued against on grounds of common sense, and she overrode on grounds of it being her store and her decision, and he conceded both points because she was correct on both counts. The store had, over the years, expanded modestly. They had added a proper postal section when the postmaster's position opened, and Eudora applied for and received the appointment, which made her the postmistress of Salvation Creek in addition to the storekeeper, a combination of responsibilities that suited her organizational instincts extremely well. Andrew had built out the east wall to accommodate the postal boxes and a small private window for the more sensitive correspondence, and the store was now the genuine civic center of the town, the place where the community's information and goods and letters all passed through. Salvation Creek itself had grown. By 1883 it had a proper school, a second church, a pharmacy, 2 more general stores that were smaller than Eudora's and less well organized, and a population approaching 200. The railroad had come within 12 miles, which changed the supply chain and meant Eudora could order goods from a broader catalog and receive them faster. It also meant that more people moved through, which was in general a good thing, though it brought its complications. One complication arrived in the spring of 1883 in the form of a man who came into the store one afternoon while Andrew was in the back office and Eudora was behind the counter, and who she recognized, with a jolt that traveled from her stomach to her chest, as one of the Greer brothers. He had grown a beard since she had last seen him, standing behind Calhoun Hayes with a gun on his hip on her porch, but the eyes were the same. He looked at her from across the store and she looked at him, and the air between them did something complicated. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said. "Mr. Greer," she said. A pause. He had a list in his hand, a shopping list, supplies. He was not, she registered, carrying a visible weapon. He looked older than she remembered. He looked tired. "I have been working a farm east of here for the past 2 years," he said. "My brother went back to Missouri. I stayed." He paused. "I am not here for anything except what is on this list." She looked at him for a long moment with the full analytical attention that her father had taught her. Then she looked at the list. "Flour, salt, lamp oil, coffee, sugar. Do you have an account here?" she asked. He blinked. "No, you can set one up," she said. "If you are farming east of here, it would save you carrying cash each time. I extend credit to known customers in good standing." He stared at her. "After everything," he said. "You have not done anything to me since Hayes left," she said. "And you are a farming neighbor now. I extend credit to farming neighbors." She opened the account book. "Your name?" "Elias," he said. "Elias Greer." She wrote it down. She filled his order without another word about Hayes or about what had been, and he paid what he owed and took his goods and left, and Andrew appeared in the doorway of the back office where he had been listening. "Eudora," he said. "I know," she said. But he was on the wrong side of something because he was being paid to be, not because he is Hayes. "I have read people my whole life. That man is not Hayes." She closed the account book. "And he is a neighbor now." Andrew looked at her with the particular look he had developed over 4 years of marriage, which was the look of a man who is continually, voluntarily astonished by the person he is married to. "You are remarkable," he said. "I am practical," she said. "Holding the past against everyone who was ever part of it is not practical. It is just expensive." She paused. "But I will be watching." "Of course you will," he said. Elias Greer turned out to be exactly what Eudora had read him to be, a man who had made bad choices while employed by a bad man, and who was, on his own, quiet and hardworking and reliable. He became a regular customer. He eventually became something approaching a peripheral member of the community, the way many frontier people did, out of the simple necessity of living near each other in a place where resources and help and community were not optional extras but practical requirements. He was never entirely comfortable in Eudora's store. She never expected him to be. But he paid his account on time, every time without exception, which she appreciated. Thomas started school in 1885 and announced within 3 weeks that he intended to be a lawyer, which was not entirely a surprise given that he had grown up watching his father compile legal documentation and his mother write letters to the legislature. Andrew told him that being a lawyer was an excellent ambition, and also that he should read as widely as possible, and he began building the boy a library with the same methodical care he had applied to rebuilding his own life. Clara, at 2, was her mother's daughter in temperament but her father's in coloring, with his gray eyes and her mother's dark hair, and a personality that expressed itself primarily through extremely focused staring at things she found interesting, which included beetles, the account books, and the mechanism of the well pump. In 1886, Eudora's letter on married women's property rights was finally acted upon by the state legislature, in the form of a committee recommendation that was strongly worded if not yet law, and she received a formal acknowledgement from the committee chairman that named her specifically as the originating voice behind the recommendation. She read the letter 3 times and then put it in the fireproof box she kept under the counter alongside the original deed and the transfer certificate and the Wichita lawyer's letter, the documents that had made everything else possible. "Your 14-page letter," Andrew said, reading over her shoulder. 37 pages by now," she said. "I have added to it." "Of course you have," he said. She turned to look at him over her shoulder. 8 years of marriage, and the look between them was layered with everything they had been through and everything they had built, and the deep, inhabited comfort of 2 people who have chosen each other fully and continue to choose each other every ordinary day. "Are you happy?" she asked, which was not a question she asked often. She was not a woman who required constant reassurance, and she knew it. But she asked it now directly, the way she did everything. He considered it honestly, the way she required honesty. The store behind them, with its perfectly arranged shelves, and its precise account books and its postal boxes, and its smell of coffee and sawdust. The back office where he had his desk and his correspondence, and the 2 ongoing documentation projects for neighboring counties. The house behind the store where Thomas was currently in the kitchen, probably trying to read the legal dictionary he had found on the bottom shelf, and where Clara was asleep in her room with the gray light of a Kansas afternoon coming through the curtains. The well in the yard, maintained as it had always been, clean and cold and reliable. "I stopped for water," he said. "And got everything." She turned fully toward him and put her hand against his face, and he covered it with his hand and held it there. "You were very solemn about it," she said. "The water." "I am considerably less solemn now," he said. "You are," she agreed. "It suits you." He kissed her in the middle of her own store in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, which was something he did without embarrassment now, without the careful restraint that had characterized his first months in Salvation Creek when everything had been new and cautious and astonishing. She kissed him back in the comfortable, confident way of a woman who has no uncertainty about where she stands, and has never had patience for pretending otherwise. From outside came the sound of the well pump being operated by someone who needed water, and the ordinary sounds of Salvation Creek going about its day, and the distant cry of Clara waking from her nap, and Andrew Whitfield, who had stopped for water on a July morning in 1878 and ridden away and come back and stayed, was exactly where he was supposed to be. He always had been. He had simply needed a well, and a woman with an ink-stained thumb and a direct gaze and a 37-page letter to the legislature to understand it. The years settled into the rich accumulation of an ordinary, extraordinary life. Eudora's letter eventually contributed in 1887 to an amendment to the Kansas Married Women's Property Statute that strengthened inheritance rights in cases where a secondary notation was the primary documentation, which was specifically the legal architecture that had protected her own property 9 years earlier. She received another formal acknowledgement. She put it in the fireproof box. Thomas, at 7, remained committed to becoming a lawyer. He read everything Andrew gave him with an intensity that was slightly unnerving in someone so small, and he had strong opinions about the county recorder system that he expressed at dinner with a seriousness that made both his parents simultaneously proud and amused. Clara, at 4, had developed a specific interest in the mechanics of the store and could already recite the contents of the highest shelves from memory, which Eudora considered a promising sign of future aptitude. She had also formed a passionate friendship with the Drummond girl, Caleb's younger sister, who was approximately the same age and shared Clara's interest in things that could be taken apart and reassembled. Caleb Drummond had indeed married the Wickersham girl, whose name was Ruth, and they had a farm of their own now and a small boy who was beginning to walk. And Caleb still came into the store regularly and still looked at Andrew with the particular combination of respect and gratitude that Andrew found both touching and slightly embarrassing. Robert Drummond died in 1887 of a heart that had been slowing for some years, and his funeral was attended by most of the county. Andrew spoke at it briefly, about the kind of quiet courage that does not get ballads written about it, but that holds communities together at the seams when powerful men try to tear them apart. Eudora sat in the front pew with her hand in Andrew's and her eyes steady and her back straight, and after she told him it was the best eulogy she had ever heard. In the fall of 1888, Eudora told him over breakfast, in the direct matter-of-fact way she had told him the first 2 times, that she was expecting again. Thomas, who was 8 and had become alarmingly perceptive about the conversational patterns of adults, looked up from his oatmeal and said, "Is this going to be another one?" "Yes," Eudora said, "another one." He considered this. "Will it argue with Clara?" "Probably," she said. He nodded with the resigned wisdom of someone who has already calculated the arithmetic of sibling dynamics. "All right," he said. "I will manage." Their third child, another son, arrived in May 1889, easy and healthy, and announced with the same conviction that Thomas had demonstrated and Clara had not. They named him Samuel for no particular family reason but because it suited him, and he had Eudora's brown eyes and Andrew's dark coloring, and a temperament that appeared in the early weeks to be primarily enthusiastic about food and sound. The store continued. The correspondence continued. The family grew, and the town grew, and the Kansas sky was enormous above it all, and the well in the yard continued to produce cold, clean water that tasted of limestone, and was maintained with the precision that Eudora applied to everything she cared for. On a morning in September 1889, Andrew was working in the back office when Eudora came in with a cup of coffee and a letter that had arrived in the post, and that had a Topeka return address on it. He opened it while she sat on the edge of the desk, which was a habit she had developed and which he found unreasonably endearing. The letter was from the State Legislative Committee chairman. It informed Mr. and Mrs. Whitfield that the documentation they had compiled over the preceding decade regarding county-level property rights abuses in rural Kansas had been formally incorporated into a comprehensive review of frontier property law currently being conducted by the state judiciary. The letter specifically cited the Salvation Creek documentation as the most thorough and well-sourced materials received by the committee to date. It expressed, in the careful formal language of official correspondence, something that was very close to gratitude. Andrew put the letter down on the desk and looked at Eudora. She was reading it over his shoulder. Her face, when she finished, was doing the thing it did when she was processing something large, the slight compression of her lips, the particular brightness in her eyes. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed. 11 years, she said, "since the first letter." "Roughly," he said. "Yes." She reached over and took the letter from the desk and refolded it along its creases with the methodical care of someone who intends to put it in the fireproof box, which was what she intended. "Andrew," she said. "Yes," he said. "When you stopped at my well," she said. "When you rode away and came back, what did you hear exactly?" He knew she meant the sound that had brought him back. "A crash," he said. "And your voice, sharp and loud, not afraid, angry," she nodded. "I had thrown a lamp at Hayes," she said. "I thought you knew that." "I did not," he said. "He had come in before the men with the guns," she said. "He came into the store alone and told me about my father and told me to sign over the deed voluntarily, and I picked up the lamp from the counter and threw it at him. It missed, which is why the glass broke on the floor. Then he went back for his men." She paused. "I was very angry." He looked at her. He had known for 11 years that she was remarkable, and she continued to surprise him with specific new evidence of it. "You threw a lamp at the county sheriff," he said. "I threw it at a bully," she said. "The badge was incidental." He reached over and took her hand, and she let him hold it, her ink-stained hand. Still always slightly ink-stained, because she never stopped writing, and writing always left its mark. And they sat together in the back office of the Keating General Store in Salvation Creek, Kansas, in September of 1889, with the sound of 3 children in the front of the store, and the sound of the town outside the window, and the great flat prairie stretching away in every direction. And he thought about what it meant to stop, not to stop running. That had happened long ago. He meant what it meant to stop genuinely in the deepest possible sense. To arrive somewhere and put down what you were carrying and choose, every day, to stay. To build the life not as a reaction to the one you had left, but as something deliberate and chosen and true. He had stopped for water. He had left with a woman he could not stop thinking about. He had come back, and he had kept coming back every day for 11 years, and every day he had found her exactly as she was, direct and clear and ink-stained and remarkable, maintaining the well and the store and the correspondence and their children and him, with the same steady, undemonstrative, absolute commitment she brought to everything she cared for. And the water, it turned out, was the least of what she had given him. The greatest of it was this: the warm back office, the letter in her hands, the 3 voices from the front of the store, and the whole unbroken, ordinary, extraordinary life that stretched forward from this moment like the Kansas plain itself, vast and clear and full of weather and full of light. "I love you," he said, not for the first time, not for the 100th time, but with the full specific weight of a man who means every word he says, and has the receipts to prove it. She looked at him with all of herself present in her eyes, the grief she had learned to live beside and the courage she had never had to learn because it had always been there, the directness and the precision and the quick, bright smile that had been transforming her face since that first morning on the store porch. "I know," she said. "I love you too. And then, the lamp, by the way, was not a good throw. I need you to know that. I have been meaning to say it for 11 years. We can work on it," he said. "We can," she said. "We have time." And they did. They had all of it, all the ordinary time of a life built right, and it was more than enough, and it was everything.